And today we have Doctors Bryant Lin and Oliver Aalami with us. Bryant Lin is a primary care physician, educator, and researcher. The cornerstone of Dr. Lin's work is keeping medicine focused on humans, patients, providers, families, and trainees, and not lost in technology and algorithms. His research and educational interests span 1, developing and testing novel medical technologies, 2, improving the health of Asian populations with precision and population health, and 3, increasing expression and interconnections in the health community with the humanities and arts. Dr. Lin serves at Stanford as clinical faculty in primary care and population health in the Department of Medicine, where he has invented and researched new medical technologies addressing unmet human-centered needs, and started the Consultative Medicine Clinic evaluating patients with medical mysteries. Dr. Aalami is a clinical professor of vascular and endovascular surgery at Stanford University and the Palo Alto VA, and serves as the director of Stanford's Biodesign for Digital Health. He is the course director for Biodesign for Digital Health, Building for Digital Health, and co-founder of the open source project Cardinal Kit, developed to support sensor-based mobile research projects. His primary research focuses on clinically validating the sensors in smartphones and smartwatches in patients with cardiovascular disease and translation of digital health solutions. Dr. Lin and Dr. Aalami, thank you for being with us, and I will hand the controls over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. It's great to be here. Welcome, everyone. We have quite a few slides to go through, so I'm just going to run through. Here are disclosures. So our learning objectives today to understand a framework to evaluate new technologies, articulate value propositions and limitations of digital health, and also appreciate the economic impacts of these new technologies. So I'm going to just start from the very top and talk about kind of why now. Why is it an interesting time? And we're basically on an unsustainable trajectory currently with regards to costs of healthcare. The U.S. spends about 17% of its GDP on healthcare, and this continues to go up about 3 to 5% a year. And you layer on top of that, despite this crazy spend, that our outcomes aren't that great compared to other nations that spend a fraction of what we spend. Add on top of that that we have a silver tsunami or an aging society. And then you add on top of that that we just aren't producing enough clinicians or providers to help address or meet the needs of all these people that will have chronic conditions. So the government realizes this, and for that reason, any new innovation that comes out that that will be supported needs to meet the triple aim or quadruple aim, and really needs to have better outcomes than what currently exists at a lower cost and to be scalable. And this just happens to be the sweet spot for digital health, which we believe, or we define as the convergence of data, connectivity, and compute power to increase access and provide personalized healthcare to improve outcomes at a lower cost. And this is just a high-level framework. It all starts with the patient and the data generated around that patient, whether it's through a mobile app, an in-person visit in a clinic, devices, wearables, sensors. That data is then analyzed in a way, and insights are gathered from that data, which then feeds back to the whole system. And healthcare is very, very, very complicated. It's very different than the consumer world when you think about innovating in this space. You have all these stakeholders to think about, whether it's the insurance companies, the government, CMS. What's unique about digital health, when we do our needs finding, for example, around this space, when you think through the scope of digital health, you have to include the patient at home as another stakeholder. And that's what makes this field so exciting. And there are certain enabling changes around data, regulatory, and reimbursement, as well as COVID most recently, that have really pushed things forward. And I'm just going to touch at a very high level on what these have been. It all started in 2009 with the HITECH Act. The US government, again, was very aware of this unsustainable trajectory. And we all have heard of the adage that if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And So it was very clear that we had a lot of paper charts. We didn't have digital charts, and the U.S. government had a very hard time of even knowing, like, where is the spend? What are the outcomes like in these various settings? It was hard to measure. So there was this huge incentive to digitize the electronic health record, and there's various meaningful use stages where it was kind of a carrot and stick model where they were providing funds to hospitals and clinics to implement electronic health records. However, they had to meet certain criteria, and it started with just basic implementation, electronic order entry, drug-drug interactions for meaningful use stage 1, and then it went to 5% of patients need to be able to view, download, and transmit data, which ended up just becoming the patient portal for meaningful use stage 2. And these are just small segments of these requirements. But what you're seeing here are the government kind of mandates, which pushed not only the digitization, but also now bringing the patient into the picture and realizing that they needed to make sure that this benefited and that the patient had the ability to view this data. And it was kind of the SAP Oracle moment, way back in 2009, when this really happened in the 1970s in the other industries. And by 2016, about 96% of the U.S. healthcare system had certified electronic health records. However, the government still realized that even though the data was digitized, it was living siloed in these various institutions or health systems. And so the next evolution of meaningful use had to be around not only allowing patients to view their data through a portal, but how can we get the data to flow outside of the electronic health records? So they said that the data needed to be available or accessible electronically via an API. And at that point, they hadn't quite specified which API, but that was the beginning of the HS7 FHIR standard being implemented slowly and coming onto the horizon. And we'll talk about that more. In March of 2020, the 21st Century Cures Act final rule was passed, and this is a huge rule, and it has an information blocking component as well, which is really important, and it mandated as this the FHIR standard-based API to be the API. So it now defined the business rules of how data needs to be exchangeable and how the data should flow. And then on top of that, they also mandate that all elements eventually need to be exposed via an API or electronically. And interestingly, this just because of COVID, things were delayed quite a bit in terms of when it was mandated. But on October 6th of last month, or October 6th, which is last month of this year, is when this finally came into law, and it's not being enforced quite yet. It's not clear how it's being enforced. You can imagine there's a lot of pushback, but this is very much a reason why the data is now available and being made available. If we talk about reimbursement, there have been also a lot of changes which create an ecosystem ripe for digital health. Most of the U.S. is still fee-for-service based, meaning that you get incentivized for heads and beds, doing procedures, keeping the care within the four walls of the hospital. And again, the government realized that this is not really in line with with lowering costs and preventive health. And the government's one of the biggest spenders. They pay over approximately 50% of all the healthcare bills in the United States. And because of this, they implemented a lot of quality payment programs and metrics. There have been various iterations, whether it's through an ACO. More recently, what's gained a lot of traction and growth is the Medicare Advantage program, which is basically Medicare managed by other outside insurance companies such as Optum, ChenMed, Oak Street Health, Humana, Kaiser, Aetna. They all participate in Medicare Advantage plans. And what's unique about this is that these insurance companies or healthcare delivery organizations actually go in at risk for these patients, meaning they get a bucket of money at the beginning of the year and are then challenged to take care of these patients. And they're very incentivized to reach out to patients, implement all the digital health tools they can for preventative measures, telemedicine, whatever it may be. So some other examples of where digital health has grown are integrated delivery networks such as Kaiser. Ochsner Health System is another nice integrated delivery network system in the South, in New Orleans. And I believe personally that they're one of the most advanced healthcare systems with a really advanced digital health offering. Currently, they have anti-hypertension programs, CHF management programs, diabetes management, pregnancy programs. They have something called an O-bar, which is kind of like a genius bar where I'll walk you through a patient story. For example, if I was diagnosed with hypertension in Epic, they'd put in the order for me to join this program. I would walk out of the clinic to one of these O-bars, pick up a subsidized blood pressure cuff. They would connect it with my phone right there at the O-bar. And then I would get text messages telling me to check my blood pressure several times a week. That would go to Epic, and a pharmacist would then review the meds and based on a protocol would send text messages back to tell me to either go up or down on my blood pressure medication. And they have solid data on this showing that they can get much better, tighter blood pressure control in much shorter time. So it's a great success story of how digital health in the right setting with the right incentives can really benefit patients. Self-insured employers are also very, very interested in digital health programs. Starbucks, for example, pays more for health insurance for their employees than they do for coffee beans to roast all their coffee. So they also have the freedom to implement any sort of programs to better manage chronic conditions or any condition really that their members have. And it turns out musculoskeletal conditions such as lower back pain, joint pain is a huge spend for all these organizations. And they've, for example, implemented Hinge Health, which is a remote physical therapy program to help, again, navigate patients away from surgery and more towards physical therapy, which is shown to be as effective, if not better, or more effective. And then I wanted to touch on the regulatory as well. FDA has been very forward-thinking in terms of addressing all the AI software or other software, and will it be regulated? Will it not be regulated? They've put out quite a few guidelines that are available online. They also have a website, the Digital Health Center of Excellence website, which you can go to. There's a link posted here. And they're actually very good at responding to questions. So if you have any question about whether your solution is going to be regulated or not regulated, you can go ahead and send them an email. It takes them a while to respond, but they provide a very comprehensive response, and I highly recommend folks to do that if they have any questions. They also made it very clear that they will not generally regulate wellness products. And I'll go into an example of that in the future, such as Omada. Omada Health basically took a program that was delivered in the YMCA in person, which was a diabetes prevention program, digitized it, added connected scale, coaching, group sessions that are remote, as well as health education. And their program is not currently being regulated by the FDA. So it's considered a general wellness program as an example. And then you have other kind of software, the Apple Watch itself isn't a regulated device. However, the software, the irregular rhythm notification for AFib is, while other metrics that have come out, such as the passive walking speed, passive 6-minute walk test, VO2 max, or temperature gauge, they've chosen not to go through FDA clearance. So just to give you a high-level view of the complexity of this. And really, in sum, I would say for this first section that what is really, I think, a huge insight is that there's been a lot of clarity from HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, ONC, the Office of the National Coordinator, that really they want the patient, in their view, they want to drive things towards a consumer or patient authorized data exchange. So give the patient the key to unlock health data. And if you are an innovator in this healthcare space and you would like to have access to your someone you're trying to serve or help with your product, that the patient or your customer has the right to ask for that data. And now we have a defined way to get that data through the FHIR APIs and so on. At least that's the vision. So I wanted to just plug Cardinal Kit, but we can get into that a little later. And I'm going to hand it over to my partner in crime, Dr. Lin.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Aalami, for a fantastic whirlwind overview of the structural changes that have been happening and that have encouraged and some could argue discouraged digital health. I just wanted to zoom out a little bit. It's hard to have a discussion about the future, of digital health without talking about technology in medicine generally. You know, sometimes as technologists, we always view technology as always a good thing. And in medicine, it's a complicated question because, we have a principle among physicians, our Hippocratic oath of do no harm. And it's not always clear that technology is beneficial. You can see a company like Intuitive Surgical, a well-known company. This is from an article, an editorial in Nature, one of the Nature magazines. And just to quote, talks about how Intuitive is loved by surgeons and patients alike for its ease of use and faster recovery times. It's less invasive than conventional procedures, but the robot's $2 million price tag and negligible effect on cancer outcomes is sparking concern that it's crowding out more affordable treatments. So, not clearly do no harm. Maybe there's some benefits, but there are also some concerns as well about cost and potentially preventing other innovation from occurring. And then, as a doctor, it's hard not to talk about Epic. Dr. Aalami talked about EMRs a few minutes ago. There's a lot of resistance to adopting EMRs initially. And Epic, of course, is the biggest, most influential EMR out there. But you can see, sometimes there are benefits, even though it was painful, can be painful to implement. This was a study looking at the implementation of an EHR in the critical care setting. And it didn't affect length of stay, but did decrease the risk of decreased mortality rates in the ICU. And that was thought to be due to potentially medication error decreases as well. So not always good, not always bad. We need to have a framework to evaluate technology in medicine, in particular digital health. There are lots of perspectives. In our digital health course, Dr. Aalami and I really look at a product development perspective, and that's the entrepreneur corporate perspective. But there are a lot of different perspectives out here, just like, if you ever visit the Leaning Tower of Pisa, where are you in this big crowd can give you a really different view of what the Leaning Tower of Pisa is and what it looks like and how it impacts you. And there's so many stakeholders in this environment. Dr. Aalami talked about the 7-headed monster, 8-headed monster, and lots of different goals, around improving health, but money, saving money, making money, curing disease, preventing disease, many, many goals around health in general and digital health in particular. For example, an entrepreneur can use this framework. What do I work on? Do I look at a large unmet clinical need? Do I look at something that's scalable, has a pathway, has a regulatory pathway, a business model, easy way to distribute and sell the product? Do you have any competitive advantage? Are there other things you need to prove that it works, like clinical trials, how to use analytics to show that your solution is something that helps outcomes or helps some sort of goal that you're going after, such as saving money or making money? Of course, there's a broad societal framework looking at population health. Can we, from the government and from societal point of view, we want to improve the health of populations where, we'd love to, of course, improve the health of individuals, but looking at it from a population health that can help you marshal resources. How do you put your money behind certain solutions so they can help the largest number of people? Looking at prevention and management of disease, value-based care. This is where the dollars come into place. And then this new part, which really digital health enables. How do you analyze this? How do you use traditional research, but also new methods of analysis to show that new solutions are actually doing what they intend to do and not causing any harm again? So wanted to also just briefly touch on what population health is. So the CDC defines population health as bringing significant health concerns into focus and addressing how those resources can be allocated to overcome the problems that drive poor health conditions in the population. So that's, again, one perspective from the CDC. So you can see how, depending on your perspective, you may use a different framework to evaluate technology. So today I'd like to go back to, as Dr. Aalami talked about, the triple aim from the IHI. And the triple aim, again, just to remind you, is focused around improving patient care, the patient experience of care, which is around both quality and satisfaction, improving the health of populations, and reducing the per capita cost of healthcare. So today we'll provide a few cases and talk about how we use that framework to evaluate new technologies, new digital technologies. So I'm going to talk about mental health, oncology, a couple of cases on oncology, and as well as, I didn't include here, wearables. Dr. Aalami will talk about case studies in wearables as well. So digital mental health, this is really an incredibly exciting area. Lots of unicorns, billion-dollar startups in this area, focused mainly around virtual care, connecting people to providers and tools. Not quite sure if they improve outcomes. It's not clear. Here are some potential benefits. This is from a practical perspective, a functional perspective. Notifications, you can monitor, perhaps track your own mental health. You can share what's going on, connecting to a professional, being part of a community, and then having a dashboard to have a really big overview, either from the provider, clinician side, or even from the patient side, about how your care is going. And you can see here, they're just focusing on the therapy aspect of mental health. Traditional approaches are in A, looking at acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, CBT, PDT, CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy, and PDT, psychodynamic therapy. And then, of course, in B, there's traditional treatment, traditional face-to-face treatment, and digital health, which is sort of the digitization of A and B as well. So kind of how do you convert these approaches and enable them digitally? So just our case today, we'll talk about Cerebral. So that Cerebral's been in the news. You can see from their website, this is just a screen capture from their website. Their tagline is expert help for your emotional health, connecting you with professionals basically at a subscription fee. This is, again, from their website, talking about what their results are, what their outcomes are. 80% of members have an initial visit, so great improvement in access, makes sense. Decrease in depression symptoms. They don't really talk about how they track this or what the metric is. And then, significant impact of large number of people saying their anxiety is better. So great. These are, sounds like all great things. So what's their business model? Well, it's, really a monthly subscription fee. You may be able to get insurance to pay for part of this, but there's a $30 monthly access fee that is not covered by insurance. And then you may be able to get insurance to cover for extra things as well as medication. But there's a problem with this model. Incentives are misaligned. Wall Street Journal had a series of articles about how they really had a great increase in number of patients that they were managing, but it seemed like a significant percentage of these were coming to Cerebral for access to ADHD medications. And there were problems with how Cerebral evaluated these patients, and there were disincentives, misaligned incentives for people, for their providers to actually provide easy access because they don't want to lose customers if they are deemed not to be needing these types of medications, which are controlled medications. And, resulted in more bad news. You can see that they cut out recently, Wall Street Journal reported they cut 20% of their staff due to this bad publicity. So, these are challenging, right? This is a company that did improve access, seemingly improved symptoms, but there was a negative side due to the incentives and conflicts of interest inherent in the way the company was structured. So again, let's go back to our framework, improving the patient experience of care. Well, one could argue that the satisfaction was improved, right? So some people did benefit. You could argue about quality. Wall Street Journal focused on a case study where there was one person under treatment who had a very bad outcome. So this is unclear, this first bullet on our framework. Did it improve the health of populations? Maybe. Again, depends on the net benefit. We don't know. We don't really have enough data. This is all secret to us, right? We only know what they've reported. I don't know if that many peer-reviewed reports from Cerebral. And then reducing costs, again, unclear whether they really reduce costs. There's this additional monthly fee that's required. So from a health equity standpoint, it's not really improving access unless you're able to pay for it. Let's move on to oncology. 7Wire Ventures, a well-known venture firm in the area of digital health, has a great, and I encourage you to take a look at their website, a great kind of overview of how digital health is involved in oncology. And this is quite a broad overview. And you can see there are many areas touched, including care navigation, around clinical trials, detection and diagnosis, research and data management, and clinical decision support. So really a lot of companies in the space, very popular area. You can see how different technologies, and again, the goal today is not really to delve into these details, but you can see how different technologies can really impact, potentially, possibly, many stakeholders and benefit oncology care. Let's focus on this case here. So this is, I think, the simplest case of where clearly digital health impacted the health of patients undergoing oncology care, something called patient-reported or e-patient-reported, electronic patient-reported outcomes systems. So there are many objectives for these systems, but we're really going to look at how this affected patients' care and as part of a clinical trial, but improved the outcomes for patients who basically self-reported their symptoms through electronic digital means. So this is a system developed out of Memorial Sloan Kettering. And you can see, again, the details aren't that important, but patients were able to report their symptoms that they were having as they underwent treatment for cancer. And they, of course, there's someone who was looking at this information, the clinical team, and was able to potentially, the idea is they were able to intervene early and so improve the treatment and accessibility for the patients. And this is looking at survival. So we always think about oncology in terms of, months of survival for drugs and treatments, really advanced technology. And this is really kind of a workflow intervention, right? You're enabling patients to report their symptoms to their care team. You can see it here. It's really amazing. You can see the dark line. These are survival curves. So usual care, there was a higher mortality with usual care than in the patient-reported symptom monitoring group and the difference was quite stark. So this was a seminal article in the space and led to the American Society of Clinical Oncologists to put this in their guidance documents that this is recommended for anyone receiving clinical cancer care. So let's go back to our framework, talk about improving patient experience of care. Clearly, patients are able to talk about their symptoms they're undergoing. It seemed to improve quality, mortality, improve the health of populations, decrease mortality. And we don't know about the costs yet, so that's something interesting. But these frameworks are fairly low cost, didn't seem to require additional clinical staffing. So it seems like it checks all the boxes for us. Let's talk about another case in oncology. This is Grail Gallery. So this is what's called a multi-cancer early detection test. So it's basically they're looking for tumor DNA. And you basically pay, it's a blood test, it's around $1,000 or so. And they will do tests looking for the presence or absence of tumor DNA in your blood. And you can see here, again, this is from their website, around 70% of deaths are caused by cancers that aren't screened for. So this is part of the push for how do we screen for more cancers? We have very few cancers, such as colon cancer, breast cancer, cervical cancer, and some could argue prostate cancer that we actually can screen for. But most of cancers we can't screen for. So this is how they look. They look at cell-free DNA from cancer cells, different than normal cells. This is what they're detecting. This is a performance from their large study, which was published, high specificity, so 99.1% specificity. but really not great positive predictive value, so 38%. So if you have a positive test, what's the likelihood that you do have cancer? So less than 50%. And then the negative predictive value is very good, but of course, most people are not going to have cancer. And you need to screen 189 people in order to detect one cancer. And this is from a different study, kind of a value-based study looked at, and you can see that the MCED plus usual care, so Galleri plus usual care, pushed diagnosis to earlier stages, which presumably will enable better treatment and lower mortality. We don't know that yet. And you can look here at the costs. Of course, it did increase costs of screening. And you can see at every level did increase costs almost across the board, except for stage 3 and stage 4, because they're pushing more people into early stage detection. And you can see here, this is again, I won't go into the weeds with quality of adjusted life years, but setting the price around $100,000 per quality adjusted life years, something a lot of these studies do. And you can see there's a tremendous variability. So we don't really honestly have the data to assess this yet. So because of that, it's interesting because it's not reimbursed by insurance. There's a lot of false positive risk. If you offer this to every Medicare beneficiary, according to Dr. Welch, you could bankrupt Medicare. So this is a concern. So we really need to study these technologies quite well before they're approved by insurance. Of course, because of this, we don't know on a randomized basis. So the National Health Service in the UK is studying whether randomizing people to Galleri testing versus usual care, what the outcomes are in the long run. And then, of course, presumably they'll track costs as well. So that'll be very interesting, this randomized controlled study. So looking at the framework for Galleri, it's possibly we're increasing quality and satisfaction. Hard to say. False positive risks, of course, are not something we want as patients or providers. Potentially improving the health of populations. Again, what's the cascade of false positive diagnosis? Hard to quantify. And the costs may increase overall. So unclear on this framework whether this type of test is something that, as a society and fulfilling the triple aim, something we should support. So stay tuned. Going to hand it back to Dr. Aalami to talk about the next case study.
Perfect, thank you. So I was going to get into a little bit about wearables. Now, Rune Labs is a really fascinating company. They're a precision neurology company, and they basically not only ingest data from imaging, but what's unique about this FDA 510K FDA clearance that they received recently this year, their Strive PD software or ecosystem, leverages the Apple Watch in order to kind of track symptoms. So something that's really hard for neurologists is to get that feedback from patients. Did the medication adjustment improve your symptoms or worsen your symptoms? And through this kind of Strive PD ecosystem, they can more objectively track how the medication is affecting the patient's system. So here's an example where a consumer wearable really combined with some other components, some clinical factors, was wrapped into this FDA-approved product by Rune Labs. So that's a really interesting case study in the neurology space. This is more forward-looking, but I thought it was pretty fascinating. Again, a consumer device, so it's a watch that can detect atrial fibrillation. There's a big study that was just awarded a massive grant. It's going to be a multi-institutional study led by Northwestern in Chicago, where for patients with atrial fibrillation who would normally stay on a blood thinner, an anticoagulant to help prevent strokes and so on, they actually would monitor the atrial fibrillation because there is a subset of these patients that go in and out of atrial fibrillation. So when they have AFib, the study app would tell them to take their pill, their blood thinner, and if they don't have AFib, they wouldn't. So here's another just interesting kind of forward-looking study to see how wearables could be used and mixed into the clinical practice or just care. And again, remember, digital health is, care outside the four walls of the hospital where most people live most of their time. We don't spend much time in the clinics or the hospitals. So that's what makes this really exciting. And then this is I'm surprised Alio doesn't get more attention. So this is another wearable. It's a patch with sensors, multiple sensors that you put over what's called an arteriovenous fistula, an AV fistula or AV graft. And this is something that dialysis patients have and need for long-term dialysis access. And what's really challenging with dialysis patients is that their fluid and electrolyte shifts are quite dramatic. And they actually have to report when they go to their dialysis centers. They need to report, what were their potassium levels, what's their hemoglobin hematocrit. And this patch, through artificial intelligence and all the sensors, is able to provide, and they received FDA approval for this, is able to provide a potassium prediction, hemoglobin hematocrit prediction, a blood count prediction. It can monitor all the vital signs, oxygen saturation. And what's another really interesting thing about Alio is that they not only provide the patch, but they've spent a lot of time thinking about the clinician portal. How are we going to deliver this information? Number one, and number two, on the patient side, it's really plug and play. So the patient gets this hub that you see here on the screen right, and that hub just automatically syncs with the device when they're home or close to the hub. So there's very little work, or it's very passive. It doesn't require much on the patient side, which is huge because, we can all dream up these great ideas for monitoring, but if it involves a lot of work on the patient side, it's actually, it's really hard to get significant engagement. So the more passive something can be, the more likely you are to be getting quality data, not to have what we call missing data. So that is kind of the summary there. I'm going to give it back to Dr. Lin to close it out here.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Aalami. So yeah, just to sum it up, it's already here. We're already in the digital future. We'll continue to evolve. We really need to watch out for misaligned incentives. So the reason why there's so much attention in this space is because there's thought to be a lot of money at stake, lots of very valuable companies. So from a healthcare perspective, we need to watch for that and make sure that the net benefit is there. Looking at the benefits versus the risks. So there are some unexpected risks, unpredicted risks, but there may be some unexpected benefits. Like, I would not have expected Epic to change mortality among ICU patients. And then lastly, we need to study these digital health tools, interventions with traditional technologies, traditional methods, clinical trials, but also we need to constantly have feedback, constantly have analytics to show that really we are not causing harm. And showing that, hey, how can we do better? The beauty of digital care is that there are a lot of incremental things we can change. It's not like a surgical device where, the days are gone where you can tweak a surgical device and, immediately have that out in the market. There's a lot of things that you need to do from a regulatory standpoint. Digital health is not the case. There are a lot of things you can do and change about digital tools, digital applications, digital interventions for health. That don't require regulatory change, and they can be adjusted on the fly in conjunction with workflow issues. Thank you for your attention today, and I hope you will also check out our class, and I think Jackie will talk about that as well.
Okay, let me begin with the first question here. Could you elaborate on why the government, through HIPAA, is holding on to EDI standard to transmit patients' claim data to clearinghouse organizations instead of payer receiving claims data directly via much better and secure encrypted systems?
What was that standard? Can you repeat the question? Which standard? Yes. The ADI? Can you repeat that?
Holding on to EDI standard to transmit
EDI
patients' claim data.
So I'll be frank. I'm not. I don't know too much about that in particular because it has to do with the payers, and I'm assuming we're talking about claims data. going from the hospital to the payers. So I don't know much about that, but I do know that they are trying to move everything to more like FHIR-based protocols and standards. That's something I do know. I don't know if you know much more about that, Brian.
I don't know if it's the government really holding on to it. There are definitely standards that are mandated, but like anything, there's a lot of slowness, and how do you enforce these things? So I think it's sort of you've got to have a stick, right? You have standards, but you also, anytime you have standards, you need to have some sort of incentive. How do you make sure that everybody is kind of following the mandates and the rules that are set up? So yeah, my perspective is just that's not necessarily built in there really yet. Just sort of like how when EMRs came out, right? When you're talking about are you actually using EMRs the way they're supposed to be used? So they had incentives and carrots and sticks there as well. So yeah, but definitely not an expert in that area. Yeah.
Thank you. And the next question is, how are the advances in sharing medical data impacted by HIPAA? It seems like there are many areas where data sharing may cross over the line that HIPAA seeks to protect.
Yeah, so I love this. I'm sorry, Brian, I'm going to jump in here just because I'm really bullish about this. I think HIPAA is there to protect us. HIPAA is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. And I truly believe it's there to help us. And again, the government is really pushing back against hospitals that are trying to hold on to their data and not share their data. Again, it goes back to that one slide I showed where I talked about the consumer-driven data exchange. So it's really the patient has the power. And the government's made it very, very clear that you, as a patient, if you want to get your data, and now you can get it electronically, or at least you're supposed to be able to, via the FHIR API. And this is really an important detail, because if you're an innovator in this space and you want to pull data from one of your users' EHR, you now have the business rules to be able to do that. So you have, in theory, you should be able to design something, and with your user's permission, you should be able to, or they should be able to pull the data on your behalf, and to help them ultimately. I hope that answers your question. I don't know, Brian, if you have anything to add.
I totally agree. I think HIPAA's there to protect patients. And yes, there is bureaucracy like in anything when you have regulations, but they're surmountable for the entrepreneur and for people working in this space. It's a lot about familiarity. And remember, HIPAA is not, this is where it's challenging, right? It's a combination of, you have to have processes in place and certain software standards. So that's part of what makes it complex. But I agree with you, Oliver. I think patients are in control. I was talking with a company called Crescendo Health, where they're trying to enable this, where people have control, and then if they want to provide their data for research or whatever, they can do it. So we're making inroads. It's a slow process.
Yeah, I'll also just say that for HIPAA, it's very much a shared responsibility, meaning like if I'm a startup and I'm, and I want to make sure I'm HIPAA compliant, it's a shared responsibility, meaning I, as Bryant said, I have to have certain processes and procedures in place in terms of making sure that everyone is trained on how to handle the data. We need to make sure that we have well-defined roles and access controls to the data. You need to make sure to have a business associates agreement in place with all your contract, server providers and database providers. So it's a kind of a shared responsibility between you and your partners. You can't just buy it necessarily. So it's a complex. It's not as complex as it seems. I'll just put it that way. It's just more of a process and procedure thing. So, all right.
There was a question about, as far as sharing data from the patient, isn't there a risk of patients misreporting their condition or their information?
Yeah, Brian, I mean, I can start there again.
Go ahead.
I think, yeah, okay. Yeah, no, 100%. I think I'll give you a great example. The Apple Watch irregular rhythm notification, 100%, it never calls an AFib or an irregular rhythm from just one rhythm detection. It needs to read, I believe it's, I may misspeak here, but it's at least 5 separate readings, 5 separate consecutive readings that need to be consistent before the confidence, their confidence goes up to make a call like that this isn't a regular rhythm. Because you're right, in the real world, when you're talking, when you have sensors, you're going to have artifact. Did you bang your arm against something, or are you walking, are you jumping? So these are real. That's a really good question from a sensor standpoint. Now, whether a patient puts in the right data or not, that I agree. That's something that you almost have to have like a double, triple check. You have to ask a question maybe in 3 different ways to make sure that the answer is very consistent. I don't know, Brian, if you have anything else.
Yeah, I think, oops, sorry. I think, yeah, I mean, it's constant about, right? It's kind of even separate from digital health, right? Patients can tell us whatever, and I think we're, as physicians, are trained to really, we're supposed to get an appropriate history and physical and really assess part of that's assessing the reliability. Of course, the default is to trust what the patient's doing. We're there for the patient. You can't always be in a situation where you're not trusting what the patient's telling you. But, you want to verify, especially if it's something you're going to hinge your opinion on. But we do that even for other things like pathology, right? If somebody comes in with a cancer, we at Stanford have asked them to get their slides in, their pathology slides, and our pathologist will then look at them just to confirm the diagnosis. So, there are certain crucial times where that data and verifying the data is important. Sometimes it's not. So I think it's an issue, but I don't think it's a issue central to digital health. It's an issue just generally with information flow in health.
Mm-hmm. Can you speak to any high-level efforts in progress to make not only access to these products or tools more equitable, but the design of them as well? So localization, multilingual, et cetera.
I'll make a comment. I think we do a terrible job. I'm the director of the Center for Asian Health Research and Education. Just from the language access point, I think it's horrible. When we have Epic My Health, right? I have, we kind of buy this big compendium of pre-canned instructions for patients. And I've had many patients tell me, oh, this looks like it was just translated directly. It's really lost a lot of this. It's almost like they just took their English version and Google translated it. And then just using My Health, right? It's in English, right? And then, changing the language. And then there's, of course, digital health literacy. So I think we're doing a terrible job. I'm not aware of, I don't know, Oliver, if you are, if there's any good system level efforts. I think they're a smaller level, and they're very much like Stanford. We're trying to do better. I just had a meeting with our health patient experience people at the hospital trying to improve this for non-English speakers. So to me, it seems to be really done at the lower level, the hospital and the clinic level. I don't know of any broader efforts to do this, at least at the government level. I don't know, Oliver, have you heard of any?
Well, I know that it's definitely in the radar, or it is becoming more and more part of the requirements for certain grants. I know the state of California, for example, the California Department of Aging just put out a huge RFP for just training home care workers, and part of it was very clear it needed to be accessible, or accessibility was a big factor, and that speaks to the digital divide as well as literacy, and so on. So I think, we're not great, because you see the greatest implementation is typically for those that can pay, and that's the top of the wealth pyramid. And so it's not necessarily fair, because the bottom of the wealth pyramid is often overlooked. But I'll be honest, there's been a huge push around, just innovating for the bottom of that wealth pyramid to make sure that more people can benefit from all these innovations. But nothing, I want to just say that at least we're talking about it, at least we're thinking about it. And there are definitely, it's very clear there's a digital divide, there's a literacy divide that we need to address to make things more equitable. Mm-hmm. I'll give another quick, this is kind of tangentially directed. The CMS just last week expanded the the rule to, for example, we know that the postpartum African-American women have a much higher mortality rate than, let's say, white counterparts. And it turned out when they did the research that a lot of this mortality postpartum came after 60 days. And currently, federally mandated Medicaid coverage is only up to 60 days. And because of this finding, they extended the federally mandated coverage for Medicaid for women up to a year. And 40% of births in the U.S. are under Medicaid. And most often those 40%, or many of those women, would lose their insurance after 60 days before this rule. So there are efforts to provide continual support, when you're thinking or looking through the equity lens.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions too, with regard to kind of data privacy. Let me pull one here. And also access. So actually, first question, can you discuss about future directions between interoperability between data from these home health devices and integrating this data with existing EMR systems?
That's a tough one. I believe this is the case still. We have some we have few examples where we can actually write into the EHR, but we don't have, I don't think we have a great system, to take that data and to put it together intelligently currently for patients. In places such as Ochsner, what they have done is they basically create reports, because it's a lot of time. You can imagine the time series data, for example, a watch or activity or something. It's a lot of data. And so they try to condense that data into reports that then you can click into from the EHR through a hyperlink. So that's what I've seen. And these are through these dashboards. And I know even at Stanford, they do that quite a bit for certain projects. But it's definitely not a norm for these data streams to be integrated with the EHR. I would say it's an exception, but it can be done. And that's what FHIR is trying to enable.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Aalami. I would just make a comment that in the cases where they are enabled, like, I'm a primary care doctor, I cover my colleagues, and some colleagues are great about getting patients, their devices connected, and we get these reports, and these huge time series data. But the vast majority of people send nothing. So it's amazing. We see, and I click, and it's like, patient reported nothing. And then, again, some of my colleagues are great, and they got like half their patients on this with high blood pressure. And it's like, click, nothing. So even when it's enabled, a lot of people are either not checking it or not sending it, or there's some technical issues. So it's interesting. I think there are multiple areas. And I really agree. I think, Oliver, you hit the nail on the head, is this, how do we intelligently use this, right? You ask any doctor, they don't want more stuff in their inbox, right? So, how do we intelligently use this data? How do we put in systems where we can do this and make it scalable, where there's not necessarily always a human being like me covering people's boxes, clicking through and acknowledging them. And then, because otherwise we just end up going through this episodic care, right? This encounter-based care, and it's sitting there, but nobody's doing anything with the data. So yeah, a lot of interesting points with that challenge.
I would add as another really great insight for all successful programs. I'll give you an example. The VA has launched quite a huge for diabetic foot ulcer prevention. There's a company called Podometrics. They have this smart mat. It's like a scale, and it just does generates a heat map when you step on it every day. More than the technology, this is what they've told us, the podiatrists at least, they feel like they've seen better outcomes in patients who are part of these programs, not necessarily because of the technology, but because the technology connects them to a care coordinator who follows up on, things. So if nothing else, this technology, if you can build it in so that it gives you easier connection to the health system, and you're someone with a chronic condition that needs better monitoring, oftentimes it's that human connection that, is the magic sauce. So I'll just say that as an insight.
No, that's great. I've got another hat on as like medical humanities and arts guy. And all these tools are just to support the human interaction really at the end.
Mm-hmm. That's great, because there's actually a question next about the risk of digital health further distancing patients from physicians. So I think you kind of answered that question in a way.
It's a tool, right? Yeah, it's a tool. It's like anything else. Some tools are good and some tools are bad. You can use them inappropriately, but it's to my mind never going to replace the human interaction. The goal would be to make it more efficient, better, higher yield, where I'm not sitting there spending a lot of time, trying to figure out somebody's insurance and what meds are covered, right? That's not a good use of my time. I'd rather spend time to talk about what the patient wants to talk about.
Yeah, and Brian, also another really important point for successful programs that I've seen is to, if you need to have some sort of a coordinator or someone to help. Engagement is really tough. You said you had a few patients, Brian, that had zero engagement, others that had great engagement. And I know from Ochsner, again, that when they had a full-time coordinator who's just responsible for pinging patients if they didn't see blood pressures coming in, checking in, we haven't seen a blood pressure from you today. That's really important in successful programs because it's otherwise hard to get engagement.
And I think last question that we have time for today, this is also along the lines of data privacy. What is preventing, say, pharmaceutical companies from using this data that's being collected to develop drugs for profit? And do you have any thoughts on that?
It's funny. I was at a talk there's this Bay Area Medical Informatics Society, and the informatics fellows hold like a symposium twice a year. And one year they had the gentleman who's the head of the Mayo's digital health, basically.
Halamka?
Halamka. So Halamka used to be at Harvard and then went to Mayo. And, they are basically spent all this time anonymizing their entire Mayo health record for part of the goal is to, for drug discovery and to let this open. And I was kind of being provocative. I like to poke the bear. And I sent a question in, and the fellows are moderating it, much like Jackie, you're moderating. And I said, hey, well, what do the patients get, right? And there are models out there. I think the Craig Venter is working on this, and the Human Genome guy, where patients will get paid based upon sharing their data, using their data. Mayo's response was, I was less enthusiastic. It was like, well, this helps everybody, right? It's kind of the general, well, this is research, this helps everybody. But, it's kind of different. I come down in that, well, if you kind of sign this blanket statement, oh, you can use my stuff, there's kind of not a sword of Damocles, but there's a leverage there, right? You're like, well, I want to get my care. I'm here at Mayo or wherever, at Stanford, wherever, to get care, so I'm just going to sign whatever because I need to see the doctor, right? As opposed to you're in a clinical trial, somebody's specifically explaining to you what's the risk and benefit and who's the benefit. So I'm with you there. I think patients should be somehow, I don't know if anybody's figured that out, compensated for use of their data. I mean, you look at companies like Google, right? They have access to hundreds of millions of people's records, right? It's quite scary, right? I don't know if I trust Google with that data. even though it's a company that's like, don't do evil. I'm like, I want a company that does good, not just doesn't do evil, right? So it's quite scary, and I think that's quite concerning. I'm not sure what to do about it.
Yeah, I would just add that there are big companies, billion-dollar companies that were formed around this. Flatiron Health, for example, was bought by Roche. And what Flatiron did is they provided an electronic health record system for free to oncologists who are managing patients with cancer, and then selling that data to pharmacy or pharmaceutical companies. And Roche just went out and bought them. I think it was, I can't remember how many billion, but it was definitely over $1 billion. So it's very valuable. It is an issue. There's a great appetite for that data. Data is really the oil, for the future.
Right.
Just needs to be refined to get all the insights.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Okay, I think we actually went a little bit over, so I think we're going to wrap up the webinar today. Thank you for all the questions. I know there are a lot of questions that we didn't actually get to. So thank you for submitting those. And if you'd like to learn more actually from Dr. Lin or Dr. Aalami, feel free to check out their course, which is Digital Health Product Development. Again, you can click the QR code here. You can visit us on Stanford Online to enroll. And we definitely encourage you to check this out as well. And a link to the recording of the session will be emailed to you within the next week or so. So feel free to visit this content again. And once again, thank you for joining us today. We hope you have a great week, and we hope to see you at our next session. Thank you so much for presenting to us today.
All right, thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.